Hey folks, Alan Mandick, the Hot Rod Hippie here, coming to you with 7 fabrication tips to make your work go smoother and give you a better finished product. Whether you're talking about general fabrication or auto restoration, I've got some tips for you. So let's check it out. So I've been working on my dad's 1965 GMC project truck right here. I've been doing a series of videos on this. I have an entire playlist that you can check out at the link up here. And through that, I've been showing you how I've been doing things, showing actual process of my fabrication work on this truck, as well as talking about the ins and outs of auto restoration, at least from my perspective. However, while doing that, I've been coming up with different tips, little detailed things that I just didn't feel that warranted their own dedicated video until I combined them all into one video. And that's where this video right here for 7 fabrication tips is coming to you. I've done a couple of these to this point. About a year ago, I did 5 fabrication tips to make your work look more professional. And about 6 months ago, I did an entire fabrication tip video as well. So it seems like every 6 months, I'm gonna have one of these videos for you folks. All the tips I'm gonna throw out at you here are pretty simple, pretty basic, but bear with me, stick around and check them all out because these are things that I see people ignore on a regular basis. I see it so often that I feel these need to be said, so please watch them all, listen to my reasons for all of them before you go ahead and head to the comments and say, that was all super basic, I didn't need to hear that. Tip number 1 is clean your materials. It's such a simple concept, but so many people just can't seem to wrap their head around it. Something like this 2x1 steel that my dad picked up at the steel supplier. When it rolls out of the plant and heads to that distributor, it's coated in oil. It builds up with grime and it gets dirty. So many people just grab it, start working with it, and don't worry about it. Their hands get filthy, their tools get filthy, and it's hard to mark on. I get this often where people see that I use Sharpie markers to go ahead and mark on materials and they say, well, you know, those Milwaukee ones, they write on rusty and oily metal better. My response is always the same to those people. Why the heck are you writing on rusty and oily metal to begin with? Go ahead and clean off the material you're working with and you'll save yourself a lot of trouble. I very commonly use wax and grease remover to wipe down my materials. It gets the oil off of there, it'll pick off the dust and the dirt while I'm working with things. That can build up while I'm working. If I'm grinding on one part of a vehicle, another part will get dusty and dirty and need to be wiped down later when I'm ready to work on that area. That's really handy for that, and it's also really handy because it doesn't wipe away my marker marks. So if I marked certain spots where I want to drill holes on this cross member, but it was really dirty and oily from cutting oil from drilling another hole, I could use the wax and grease remover, wipe off that oil that I was dealing with, but it won't take away my Sharpie marks. When I am ready to get rid of my Sharpie marks or I really need to clean something, I can use acetone or lacquer thinner and they'll wipe that stuff away. Now this also applies when I'm talking about auto restoration, like the hood on the C10 that I've been working on. It had primer and body filler on the hood when I started with it. On the underside, it had surface rust. That was all stuff that I had to get off of there to start working on it. I want to be down to bare material before I start working on something. Trying to feel or see dents and dings in a panel is more difficult when it has filler or primer or paint on it. I want that stuff gone. It's easier to deal with when it's bare metal. Surface rust is also an issue because if you're hammer and dollying on something, your dollies or your hammers are going to get that surface rust impregnated into the face of them as you're hammering those materials together. And that means you're going to have to clean up your tools more often, leading to them having a shorter lifespan. You don't want to be doing that. Why damage your tools when you can take a few minutes extra to begin with and clean things up and get started the right way? Next up is something that really applies to auto restoration, but in general fabrication stuff it can really come up as well, and that is have your parts. This applies in a lot of situations, and where it's most commonly come up for me in the auto restoration world is I'll get a car in, and one of the first things that I do is I look it all over and I plan the project to see where we want to head with things, what needs to be repaired, where it's rusty, what needs to be cut out, things like that, and we get a game plan together. We'll get a parts list together and get parts coming. And I've had bosses in the past who want to get work started so they can start billing hours and so the project moves forward. But the problem is I don't like to cut anything apart until I have the new parts that are going to go in place of things. I also often run into things where the patch pieces are just not large enough. So I've got rust up 1.5 feet on a fender. I order the patch piece and it looks big enough in the catalog. I get it in and I realize that the piece is only 1 foot long. If I would have cut all the way up to my rust spot, I now have a 6-inch section that I don't have any material for. And I'm gonna have to create something for that. I'm gonna have to make a piece to fill in there. And I can work with that. But if I cut that 1.5 feet off of there, getting the length right on a fender might have been very difficult. Or making the patch pieces might have been difficult trying to transition between 2 pieces without having a template to work off of. It just does not work out. I never ever cut apart something without having the new pieces that I'm gonna be working with at hand and ready to work with. In the general fabrication sense, this can happen in multiple situations. Maybe somebody wants you to make bag brackets for them for this airbag, and all they have is a technical drawing because they haven't ordered the airbag yet. Well, you can work off of a technical drawing and you can make a bracket, and it may be correct, but for all you know, since that technical drawing is produced, the manufacturer changed something and the bolt spacing is a little bit different because they had a recall on them and they had to change a little bit, but they haven't updated the technical drawing yet. More often than not, it ends up biting me in the butt where I have to make at least minor modification to the stuff that I already did, which is just a waste of my time and my customer's time. The next tip is to back up your drill bits. So this is when you're drilling through something and you're worried about hitting the object behind it. I already talked about this on TikTok, so I'm gonna use my own words on there to show you what I'm talking about. I have a random fabrication tip for you. I'm gonna show you right now. I'm working on the hood of the 65 GMC that I'm working on back there, and I'm getting these nutserts installed in it. The reason I'm doing this is the turn signals are part of the hood of this truck, not the front end, so I need to route the wiring through the hood clean. This means I'm drilling these braces for nutserts to be installed. When I drill, I run a really good chance of this drill bit pushing too far and hitting the outside hood skin and leaving a ding on the outside. I have a couple of options for how to get around that. One, I could use a drill bit stop. I don't have one here. Two, I could use really hefty muscle control and just make sure I don't push through. That's tiresome and risky. I've got a whole bunch of holes to drill. Likely I would screw that up. Or option number three, I can back up that hole with a piece of metal. What I'm doing is I'm sticking this up in here, and now I'm backing up that hole with this spoon so I can drill through there, and all I'm gonna hit is this. This just happens to be what I'm using because I don't mind drilling into the back of it, but you can use any flat piece of metal or sheet metal. Thicker would be better though. All that just so I can get these clamps onto here so I can route the wiring clean. The next tip is always fully bolt on your parts. Say I was working on this bag bracket here and I want to bolt this in place so I can mount up the lower bracket in place. I need to make sure that I put every bolt into this part. So often I see people just lightly hand tighten in one bolt to hold a part in place, and they look at it and go, yeah, that's good. But what they don't realize is that when it comes to assembly and they put, say the part has 4 bolts that hold it together, but they only put 1 bolt in when they were mocking everything up. They put in all 4 bolts only to realize that the 3rd bolt didn't line up and they had to egg a hole out. Well, now you have a painted part where you have to egg a hole out to make it fit. That's not ideal. You should have done that before it ever got to paint. Or you end up in a situation where something's not fitting and you just can't figure out why. But when you fully bolt it on, that last bolt pulls the part into alignment and it's fine. If you didn't fully bolt it in though, you might start modifying the part to get it where it's supposed to be, and when you bolt it together, it's wrong. On the C10, I actually ran into this on the front fender. My dad mocked up one of the front fenders on this truck, and he found that he just couldn't get the alignment the way he wanted it. I stepped back and I looked at it, and he was talking about starting to modify things, and I said, wait a second. How many bolts do you have in that fender? He said, well, I got 1 up here and I got 2 back here. I said, no. Get all of the bolts in that part before you continue on. He did that, he pulled it into place, he got all the bolts started where they're supposed to be, and the part lined up. It was just a matter of needing to manipulate the part into place and getting it fully bolted together for it to actually work the way it was supposed to work. This is just something you need to do. You would be amazed how much things change when you fully bolt them together. And I'm not even just talking about running things in by hand, I mean tighten them up the way they will be installed when you're completely done your project. It matters. If you can't get it to tighten up, you need to make sure to change things so that you can. If you bolt it all up and things are out of alignment, it moves out of square or it twists or whatever, you need to address that now, not later. Now the next 2 are both welding tips, and they apply whether you're MIG welding or you're TIG welding. Next up is practice with both hands. This is something that I've seen even old timers who've been doing this for decades not do, and it confuses me. Personally, I make it a point to practice welding with both of my hands. Now I'm right hand dominant, so my primary use of a MIG torch would be something like this. Right hand, maybe my left hand steadying my right hand, but my right hand really controlling things. However, there are many situations where it's easier to access things with my left hand, whatever situation that I'm in. However, if I never ever practice with my left hand, it'd be very difficult to get an adequate weld doing that. So I make a point of, when I'm in situations where I'm at a welding bench or in situations where it doesn't matter so much, I practice with my left hand anyway, even though I don't have to. I find this to be especially true when we're talking about TIG welding. I'm usually holding right-hand torch, left-hand filler rod. However, I practice left-hand torch, right-hand filler rod on a regular basis. Something like the rear axle bag mounts on this C10. Just yesterday, I was welding on this thing, and I found that getting in there was far easier to switch back and forth on my hands to get the welds on this thing. Now, neither one of those welds is really as good as I would like it to have been. They were mainly just root passes. I TIG welded on there, and then I capped over top of that with a MIG welder to get a good solid weld on this thing, since those bag mounts are very critical to this truck. However, I did those the same left-handed and right-handed. I really didn't feel there was much of a difference in my welding there. My biggest problem when it comes to welding left-handed with the TIG is actually my right hand feeding filler rod. I'm so not used to it, but I have more trouble feeding the rod in than I do feeding a rod with my left hand. I've seen so many welders who get into these really contorted and weird positions just so they can use their right hand to hold a torch, where their left hand would have gotten the job done so much easier, but they just couldn't do it because they never practiced non-dominant hand welding. Next up is practice your welds. Now, when I talk about metal shaping demonstrations and I show you these things and I teach things, I always preach practice, practice, practice. But that's not exactly what I mean here. What I'm talking about here is actually just practicing directly before you're going to weld. If you know you're going to be welding 3/16 plate to 3/8 inch plate, like I had to do on this rear axle here for these bag brackets, take some scrap pieces of metal, mock them up on the workbench in ideal conditions, get comfortable with it, and start welding. Make sure you got your welder dialed in before you ever strike an arc on the actual finished part you need to do. I find most of the time, if you're gonna make a mistake when you're welding a part, it's gonna happen right when you start. Either your weld settings are wrong, the gas was off on your tank, or you had the wrong filler material. Something is gonna go wrong right when you strike an arc and you get going, and you'll figure it out really quickly. Rather than ruining your final part or having to grind out a section of weld or something like that, get all set up on the workbench and do a practice piece before you do the finished piece. This can be especially true if you're rusty with things. Like, I don't weld aluminum very often. I do it, and I have done it numerous times this week. However, I don't do it regularly. So this fuel tank that I'm sitting on right now, I did a whole dedicated video on building this fuel tank. When I did that, I hadn't welded aluminum in a while. So I mocked up a couple of prep pieces, cutoffs of this tank, so I had the exact material I was going to be working with, and I welded up some test pieces before I ever filmed that video so that I knew what I was getting myself into. I could get a feel for it again without having to worry about ruining the part that I was going to be showing. This is especially true when you're talking about things like this axle in this truck, or welding underneath of a floor pan, or all kinds of these weird situations you're going to be working with when you're working on a vehicle or in a fabrication situation. If you do the ideal condition one beforehand, you at least have an idea of how it's supposed to go when you get to the situation that's not ideal. The last tip that I have for you folks actually ties almost all of these back together into one thing, and that is slow and steady. In my opinion, fabrication and metalworking is a tortoise and the hare situation, and the tortoise will always win that race. Cleaning all your materials, having all the parts you're going to be working with, fully bolting those parts on, not just skipping a few of the fasteners on them, and practicing welding with your non-dominant hands. Those are all things that are going to be a little slow and a little tedious at times, but they will save you so much trouble in the long run, or allow you to get a better finished job when you're done. The best tip that I can give you out of all of these in this video is just take your time. Not even measure twice, cut once, measure a dozen times and drill and cut once. Making sure you get that hole in the right place will save you from having to egg a hole out or drill it out to a larger size. Making sure you spend your time wisely. Sure, it may take you longer than somebody else to get the job done, but you'll probably end up with a better quality job in the end. I've had coworkers and employers over the years who say, you know, so-and-so gets the job done quicker than you. And I have to turn to them and say, who does the better quality job? I'm not trying to sound conceited when I say that. I'm just saying that spending a little more time focusing on the details and making sure you get things done right will eventually allow you to be quicker as well. Because you focus on improving your skills and taking your time, you get a better feel for things, and eventually you will get quicker at them. It feels to me like sometimes people think I'm going to give them some super insider professional level tips and tricks, and I try to do that for you folks. But at the end of the day, the best things that I can provide for you is telling you to focus on the details. Making sure that the small details are to the professional level is what's really going to add up to making your work better. All right, folks, I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please go ahead and drop it a like. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think of these tips? Are they going to be useful for you and your projects? Let me know what you're thinking in the comments down below. Check out the Patreon account, patreon.com/HotRodHippie, that directly supports this channel, and get subscribed to keep up to date with all the Hot Rod Hippie content. Thanks for coming around, folks.